So in some ways, this video is sort of a full circle moment because one of my favorite videos that I've ever done on this channel, and one of the first ones to do really well, was about Evan Peters and specifically his working relationship with Ryan Murphy. In that video, I spoke about Ryan's tendency to sort of push Evan into dark roles on American Horror Story, and at that time Dahmer, which had just come out on Netflix, and my own thoughts on true crime content and the fact that I don't think Dahmer as a show needed to exist, because I think true crime reenactments are inherently an exploitative and a pointless form of media. And not to be like, I told you so, but it seems like the culture has collectively caught up with that criticism. Okay, so first let's get into a recap of Ryan Murphy and his various antics up until this point, and then we'll get into why I think true crime reenactment series are not good. In fact, I think they're very bad. So, in case you are completely unfamiliar, Ryan Murphy is the guy who made Glee, a show that is about a high school glee club and also psychological warfare kind of. Anyway, one of Ryan's other greatest hits is American Horror Story, a seasonal anthology series that definitely has some hits and some misses. But the most successful seasons of American Horror Story have always been a combination of a fictional basis with historical influences. You know, in these seasons, Ryan clearly has a knack for capturing the macabre aesthetic while pulling in influences from real life events, especially in seasons like Coven or Roanoke. But when Dahmer came out, it was clear that Ryan was interested in crossing the line from scary fiction with a hint of real life influence to disturbing real life events with a hint of fiction. I didn't watch Dahmer because I think if you want to learn about the real life serial killer, you could just watch any of the documentaries available about him and get a more honest look of his portrayal and who he was as a person. I don't see the point in a fictionalized recreation of his crimes, and it doesn't even really have to do with, you know, how Murphy chooses to humanize him in it, if he does. It has more to do with the fact that there are educational alternatives that are actually available. And because those alternatives exist, a fictionalized retelling is inherently just an exploitative cash grab. And if you don't feel that way, ask yourself why there is no popular, fictionalized school shooting media right now. It's because the subject matter is still too raw and too uncomfortable. This will change 10 years down the line when Hollywood realizes that they can apply the same sex appeal rock star-esque lens to school shooters like they're currently doing for serial killers. Not to mention that Ryan Murphy didn't consult any of the victims of the Dahmer cases before going ahead and making the series, and we know that because at one point I believe he did say that he reached out and none of them responded back. They didn't really want anything to do with the series, and of course he went ahead and made it anyway, and now we know what happens when he just kind of like ignores the prospect of reaching out to families altogether in order to make a series, and what happens when the subjects involved in that story actually decide to respond.
The second installment of Netflix's Monster series retells the Menendez brothers' gruesome murder of their parents and subsequent sentences of life in prison without parole. The reviews are mixed, and among those giving it a thumbs down is Erik Menendez. He says it's a dishonest portrayal of what happened.
Okay, so following the success of Dahmer, which is actually part of a Ryan Murphy series called Monsters, which is meant to kind of follow these various killers and crimes, the second installment follows the case of the Menendez brothers. Erik and Lyle Menendez were convicted of murdering their well-connected Hollywood parents back in 1989. The defense argued that the Menendez brothers killed their parents out of fear for their lives following alleged sexual abuse at the hands of their father. However, the prosecution argued that the killings were done due to financial gain. Both brothers were sentenced to life in jail, and they each have respective legal teams fighting to repeal their sentences. Much like Dahmer was criticized for the fictionalization and inherent sexualization of Dahmer and his crimes, Monsters, the Erik and Lyle Menendez story, is being criticized for the same thing, specifically the fact that the show portrays the brothers in an incestuous relationship with one another, something that they have denied in court. The show also apparently suggests that the pair made up the whole story about their sexual abuse for sympathy, a framing that some find disingenuous and or straight up inaccurate, and could potentially harm the case for their release. Following the release of the show, the family of Erik and Lyle Menendez put this statement on social media saying, "We are virtually the entire extended family of Erik and Lyle Menendez. We are 24 strong, and today we want the world to know we support Erik and Lyle. We individually and collectively pray for their release after being in prison for 35 years. We know them, love them, them and want them home with us. Ryan Murphy's Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story, is a phobic, gross, anachronistic, serial episodic nightmare that is not only riddled with mistruths and outright falsehoods, but ignores the most recent exculpatory revelations. Our family has been victimized by this grotesque shock drama. Murphy claims he spent years researching the case, but in the end relied on debunked Dominic Dunn, the pro-prosecution hack, to justify his slander against us and never spoke to us. The character assassination of Erik and Lyle, who are our nephews and cousins, under the guise of a storytelling narrative is repulsive. We know these men. We grew up with them since they were boys. We love them, and to this very day we are close to them. We also know what went on in their home and the unimaginably turbulent lives they have endured. Several of us were eyewitnesses to many atrocities one should never have to bear witness to. It is sad that Ryan Murphy, Netflix, and all others involved in this series do not have an understanding of the impact of years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Perhaps, after all, Monsters is about Ryan Murphy. According to Erik's wife Tammy, Erik also released a statement of his own, calling Netflix's portrayal dishonest, and saying that Murphy shapes his horrible narrative through vile and appalling character portrayals of Lyle and of him, and calls the whole series disheartening slander. So you'd think that maybe this would be a good opportunity for Ryan Murphy to impact whether or not his intentions are good or not, and how his actions are impacting the families of these victims, and maybe like craft a statement accordingly that is at the very least responsive and sensitive to their feelings. But instead he was just like, well, I'm Ryan Murphy and I don't give a fuck. I made Glee an American Horror Story, and so like I don't have to, give a shit about whether or not any of my actions have consequences. Cool. Okay, so this is normally where I would read the statement to you and talk about my opinion and perhaps a little bit of analysis, and I am gonna do that, but I just want to say, like, as I'm reading through this to get ready to read it to you, Ryan Murphy, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, genuinely, what the fuck is wrong with you? When asked about the criticism from the Menendez family in an interview published with People magazine, Ryan Murphy said, quote, "I feel like that's faux outrage, because if you look at what we do, we give those boys so much airtime to talk about what they claim as their physical abuse. We live in a sort of culture of outrage that a lot of things are knee-jerk, and that's fine. I'm used to being controversial, it's not new to me." He says that their case is suddenly a water cooler conversation, and that a lot of people think they were dealt a bad hand in that second trial. A lot of people think they should get a new trial, and I think having those conversations are good. So if we're doing anything that can further a conversation about abuse and also ask the question, was that second trial fair? Then I did my job. He also responded to the criticisms of the Menendez family more directly, saying, quote, "I don't know what story they would want to be told. How do you assassinate the character of two people who killed their own parents? I find that an interesting choice of words, and I don't agree with it." And then the last thing I want to talk about here is the criticism about the decision to portray an incestuous relationship with the brothers, to which Murphy responded, "We're not presenting any of it as truth. We're presenting it as someone's opinion. All of that stuff is woven into a narrative that Dominic Dunn talked about in articles. It was also thrown up in court several times. I'm not saying that it happened. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I'm saying that it was part of the big folkloric tapestry of that case that might have swayed juries in a certain way or not." Okay, let's talk about why all of that is bad. Like every single part of what he said is bad, is not good. It's not necessarily, a crime to make media inspired by real events. For example, one of the most acclaimed episodes of Donald Glover's FX series Atlanta is a story about a young boy named Laquarius who gets kicked out of his home and is taken in by a white lesbian couple who turn out to be extremely abusive. The episode is thought to be based on the true story of the Hart family murders, which took place in 2018, in which Jennifer Hart drunkenly drove her wife and her adopted children off a cliff. Laquarius is thought to be a stand-in for Devonte Hart, who was a middle child in that family. And the episode takes creative liberties with Laquarius' journey through school, which is done in deliberate contrast to the actual story to illustrate the complexities of a young black boy growing up in this kind of environment. The parallels to the original true crime story are real, but they're intentional, and Donald Glover is trying to illustrate a specific point here with this portrayal versus the actual events of what unfolded. Whereas Ryan Murphy is just using name recognition of a sexified true crime story to make controversial, addicting, sleazy TV. Because true crime has an alluring aspect to it, a car crash feeling, where we want to know all of the gruesome details. It's something that we can't look away from. And Murphy is using a rather journalistic defense in the sense that he's claiming that he has done due diligence with this project by showing all perspectives in the show based on the amount of available information out there. And as we know, with true crime cases and court cases in particular, there can be conflicting narratives and testimonies and evidence, but you are ultimately choosing to show one. And whether you like it or not, your choice to depict certain acts is inherently a cosign of truth, and that wouldn't be such a big issue if it weren't for the fact that the people in this case are alive and imprisoned. And not only are they alive and imprisoned, and you didn't consult them beforehand, but they are also trying to get released. And whether we like it or not, public perception of a case, fictional media or otherwise, can sway the perception of the legal system. So Ryan Murphy can say that he's trying to open up a conversation all he wants, but his choice to create this series could directly fuck with whether or not the Menendez brothers are actually going to get out of prison, which is a pretty big implication for a Netflix series. Ultimately, I can tell what Ryan Murphy's mentality is here and why he feels no guilt over the situation, because his viewpoint is probably rather simplistic. It likely has to do with the fact that whether they like it or not, criminals, especially those involved in high-capacity public trials, are technically public figures. And once you become a public figure, especially if you do something reprehensible in the eyes of the justice system, you lose a lot of your autonomy. Ryan Murphy doesn't feel the need to treat the Menendez brothers with any kind of reverence or respect because they are murderers. It doesn't matter why they did the crime, they were convicted. I'm actually surprised that this got as much backlash as it did, because I remember when Dahmer came out and I made that video, I had a lot of people fighting with me and disagreeing with me, and I think maybe the perception toward Murphy's work on this monster series changes based on how far away in time the crime occurred. Jeffrey Dahmer is dead. He's more of like a legend himself now than he was ever a real person, just because of how like time and canonization and media depiction works. But the Menendez brothers are alive, and this series has the potential to impact whether or not they're gonna get a retrial or a release. And if you're one of those people who's okay with this series existing now, I promise you, there's gonna be a time when you're not okay with it. And Ryan Murphy doesn't give a fuck because he's currently taking the position of like, well, we're not making a documentary, so any kind of editorializing we do is fine. And also, we're including all of these perspectives, so therefore we're not saying anyone is true, even though that contradicts the fact that you actively wrote a narrative to take a certain position and portray characters in a certain way. That's how writing works. In conclusion, Ryan Murphy, you are a fraud. Stop exploiting people involved in true crime cases and go back to writing fictional stories that don't have many real-world implications. And if you can't do that, then maybe you're just not that good of a writer at all. Thank you so much for watching, you guys. A reminder that you can follow me at all the social media listed in this beautiful link tree, which can be found in the description down below. Follow me on Twitter. I've been talking a lot about movies recently. We might make some movie-based videos on here within the next couple weeks, I think. Happy fall, and I'll see you next time.